The black car sped through the gates so fast that gravel sprayed against the windows, and Grace Bellamy nearly dropped the folder she was holding when the front door of the mansion swung open before she even reached it. A tall man in a dark coat stood there, his eyes sharp and tired at the same time, and behind him stood a small boy who did not look up, did not smile, and did not say a single word. "You are late," the man said, though the clock on the wall behind him showed she was 3 minutes early. "I am Grace Bellamy," she said, keeping her voice calm even though her heart was pounding. "I was told to arrive at 9. I changed my mind about the time. I do that often." He stepped aside to let her in, his gaze moving over her quickly, the way people did when they were deciding whether she belonged somewhere. She was used to that look. She had been getting it her whole life, in job interviews, in stores, in rooms full of people who expected a nanny to look a certain way. She lifted her chin and walked past him into the wide hall. The house was beautiful in a cold way, all marble floors and tall windows, but there was something wrong with the silence inside it. No music, no laughter, just the ticking of a large clock somewhere far off and the small boy standing near the staircase, watching her with wide, careful eyes. "This is Leo," the man said. "My son, you will care for him during the day. You will not ask questions about my business. You will not leave the property without permission, and you will not last like the others." Grace looked at Leo instead of answering right away. He was maybe 6 years old, thin, with dark hair that fell over his forehead and eyes that seemed too old for his face. He did not move toward her. He did not move away either. He simply watched, as if waiting to see what kind of person she would turn out to be. "Hello, Leo," she said softly. "My name is Grace. I like drawing and I am terrible at chess. Maybe you can teach me." Leo blinked. He did not answer, but something in his shoulders loosened just slightly, the smallest change, and Grace noticed it because noticing children was the one thing she had always been good at. The man cleared his throat. "I am Dante Morty. This is my house. My son does not speak much anymore. The last 3 women who worked here gave up within a week. I do not expect you to be different." "Then I suppose I will surprise you," Grace said, and she saw a flicker of something cross his face, not quite a smile but close to one, before it disappeared again behind his guarded expression. He led her through the house quickly, pointing out rooms without much warmth, the kitchen, the study she was not allowed to enter, the garden where Leo was permitted to play but only under watch. Grace noticed the men standing near the windows, quiet and still, their eyes moving over the grounds instead of looking at anything in particular. She noticed the cameras tucked into corners. She noticed how every door seemed to lock from the inside. She said nothing about any of it. She had read enough about the Morty name before taking this job to understand what kind of world she was stepping into. She had needed the money badly enough to accept anyway. But now, standing in that cold hallway with a silent little boy beside her, she realized the money was no longer the only reason she wanted to stay. That first day, Leo did not speak a single word to her. He sat in his room and drew pictures of a house with no windows while Grace tried gentle questions that went nowhere. She did not push. She had learned long ago that pushing only made frightened children retreat further. So instead she sat beside him and drew her own picture, a lopsided sun with a smiling face, and slid it across the table toward him. He looked at it for a long moment. Then, without a word, he pushed his own drawing back toward her, just an inch, just enough for her to see it clearly. It was the same house with no windows, but now there was a small figure standing outside it alone. Grace felt something tighten in her chest, but she kept her voice light. "That's a good drawing, Leo. Can you tell me who that is standing outside?" He shook his head just once and went back to his paper. She did not press further. She simply stayed close, humming quietly as she worked on her own drawing, letting the silence between them feel less lonely than it had been before she arrived. At dinner, she ate with Leo in the small breakfast room instead of the formal dining hall, ignoring the surprised look from the housekeeper who told her that nannies usually ate in the kitchen. Grace only smiled and said she preferred to eat with her charge, and the older woman, whose name was Marta, studied her for a moment before shrugging and setting an extra plate. "You won't last," Marta said quietly, not unkindly, just stating a fact the way one might mention the weather. "None of them do. This house eats people up." "We'll see," Grace answered, cutting Leo's food into small pieces even though he was old enough to do it himself, because she noticed his hands trembled slightly when he tried, and she did not want him to feel embarrassed in front of her on the very first day. Later that night, after Leo had been put to bed, Grace stood by the window of her small room on the second floor and looked out over the dark garden. She could see the shapes of guards moving along the wall, their flashlights sweeping slowly across the grass. She thought of the drawing Leo had made, the lonely figure outside the house with no windows, and wondered what that boy had seen to make him draw such a thing. A knock on her door startled her. When she opened it, Dante Morty stood in the hallway, his jacket removed, his sleeves rolled up, looking less like the cold man from that morning and more like someone who had been carrying a weight for a very long time. "How was he today?" Dante asked, his voice rougher than before. "He didn't speak," Grace said honestly, "but he drew something for me. I think he's trying to tell me things in the only way he feels safe doing it right now." Dante's jaw tightened. His mother died 8 months ago. He stopped talking 3 days after the funeral. The doctors say there is nothing wrong with him physically. They say it is grief. I say it is something else, but no one listens to me. "What do you think it is?" Grace asked, surprised he was telling her this much on the first night. He studied her for a long moment, as if deciding whether she deserved an answer. "I think he saw something that night, something he has not told anyone, and I think whoever was responsible for his mother's death does not know how much he remembers." The words hung heavy in the hallway between them. Grace felt a chill move through her that had nothing to do with the temperature of the house. "Then he needs to feel safe before anything else," she said carefully. "Not pushed, not questioned, just safe." Dante nodded slowly, something unreadable passing behind his eyes. "That is why I hired you, not because of your papers, though they were good. Because when I watched you walk in this morning, you did not flinch when the guards looked at you the way they look at everyone who enters this house. Most people flinch." "I've had plenty of practice not flinching," Grace said, thinking of years of doubtful looks and dismissive comments about her size, about whether she could keep up with active children, about whether she was the right kind of nanny for wealthy families. She had stopped explaining herself to people who judged her before knowing her, a long time ago. Dante almost smiled again, that same flicker from the morning. "Good, you will need that here." He turned to leave, then paused. "There are things you should know for your own safety. Do not open the gate for anyone, even if they claim to be family. Do not answer questions from strangers about Leo's schedule. If you notice anyone watching the house who should not be there, come to me immediately, day or night." "You're frightening me a little," Grace admitted. "Good," Dante said again, quieter this time. "Frightened people stay careful. Careful people keep my son alive." He left her standing in the doorway, and Grace closed it slowly, her mind spinning with everything she had learned in one single day. She was not just a nanny in a wealthy house. She was a guardian standing at the edge of something dangerous, something that had already taken a mother's life and silenced a little boy's voice. She thought about leaving. She thought about it seriously, standing there in the quiet of her new room, listening to the wind move against the windows. But then she thought of Leo's drawing, the small lonely figure standing outside a house with no windows, and she knew she was not going anywhere. The next morning, Leo was sitting at the breakfast table when she came down, already dressed, his hair combed neatly by someone, his eyes following her as she entered the room. She sat across from him and smiled. "Good morning, Leo. Did you sleep well?" He did not answer with words, but he slid a piece of paper across the table to her. It was a new drawing. The house still had no windows, but this time there were two figures standing outside it instead of one. Grace felt tears prick at the back of her eyes, and she blinked them away quickly, not wanting to frighten him with a display of emotion he might not understand. Instead, she simply smiled wider and said, "I like this one even better." Leo almost smiled back, almost. Over the following days, small changes began to appear. Leo started sitting closer to her during their lessons. He began nodding or shaking his head to answer simple questions instead of ignoring them entirely. He showed her his favorite toy, a small wooden train that had clearly been played with many times, its paint worn away at the edges from years of little hands. Grace learned the rhythm of the house slowly. She learned which guards nodded at her in greeting and which ones still watched her with suspicion. She learned that Dante left early most mornings and often did not return until after Leo was asleep, his face tired and his shoulders heavy with things she did not ask about. She learned that Marta, despite her early warning, began leaving an extra biscuit on her breakfast plate each morning, a small sign of quiet approval. But she also began noticing other things, things that made her uneasy. A car that seemed to pass the front gate more often than a car should. A gardener she did not recognize working near the outer wall for 2 days before disappearing entirely. A phone call she overheard Dante taking in a tense, low voice, the words rival and territory and warning drifting through the study door before he noticed she was near and closed it firmly. One afternoon, nearly 2 weeks after she had arrived, Grace took Leo into the garden for their usual walk. The sun was warm, and for the first time since she had met him, Leo reached out and took her hand without being asked, his small fingers curling around hers as they walked along the stone path near the roses. "You know," Grace said gently, "you don't have to tell me anything you don't want to. But if you ever do want to talk about anything, about your mom, about anything at all, I will always listen, and I will never make you feel bad for whatever you say." Leo was quiet for a long moment, his eyes on the flowers ahead of them. Then, in a voice so soft she almost missed it, he spoke his first words to her. "She told me to be quiet. She told me to hide." Grace's heart stopped for a moment. She kept her voice steady, though everything inside her was racing. "Who told you to hide, Leo?" But he had already gone silent again, his small hand tightening around hers, his eyes wide and distant, as if he had said more than he meant to and was already regretting it. Grace did not push. She simply squeezed his hand gently and continued walking, letting him know without words that she had heard him, that she was not going anywhere, and that whatever secret he was carrying, he did not have to carry it entirely alone anymore. That evening she told Dante what Leo had said, watching his face turn pale, and then hard with a fury he fought to control. He thanked her quietly, then walked away toward his study, and Grace stood alone in the hallway, understanding for the first time just how deep the danger around this family truly ran, and how much Leo might be carrying inside that small, silent frame of his. She looked toward the window, toward the dark garden beyond it, and made a quiet promise to herself. Whatever this family was facing, whatever shadows moved beyond those tall iron gates, she was not leaving Leo to face it alone. Not now. Not when he had finally begun to speak. Later that night, unable to sleep, Grace walked quietly down to the kitchen for a glass of water. The house was dark except for a thin line of light beneath the study door. She meant to pass by without stopping, but she heard Dante's voice, low and strained, speaking to someone on the phone. "I do not care what it costs," he was saying. "Find out who has been asking about the boys' routine. I want a name by morning." Grace stood frozen in the hallway, her glass of water forgotten in her hand. She had known, in a distant way, that danger existed somewhere beyond the walls of this house, but hearing it spoken about so plainly made it suddenly, sharply real. She thought of Leo's small hand in hers that afternoon, of the fear in his voice when he spoke of hiding, and she felt a fierce, unexpected protectiveness rise in her chest. The study door opened before she could move away, and Dante stepped out, his eyes finding her immediately in the dim hallway light. For a moment, neither of them spoke. "You heard that," he said. "It was not a question." "Some of it," Grace admitted. She saw no point in lying to him. "Is someone really watching this house?" Dante rubbed a hand over his tired face before answering. "There are people in my world who would like nothing more than to see me weakened. A grieving, silent child is a weakness they notice. I have men watching every road that leads to this property, cameras on every wall, and still, I do not sleep well most nights." "He's safe here," Grace said, though even as she spoke the words, she was not entirely certain she believed them herself. "He is safer here than anywhere else," Dante corrected quietly. "That is not the same thing as safe. Nothing about my life offers safe, not truly. I know that better than anyone." Grace studied his face in the low light, seeing past the hard lines and guarded eyes to something more tired, more human than she had expected to find in a man like him. "Why tell me this? You barely know me." "Because you are the first person in 8 months who has made my son speak," Dante said simply. "That means you matter to his safety now, whether either of us likes it or not. I would rather you understand the danger than walk through this house believing it is simply a beautiful place to work." "I appreciate the honesty," Grace said, and she meant it, even as a small shiver of fear moved through her. Dante nodded once, then seemed to hesitate, as if there was more he wanted to say but could not quite find the words for it. Finally, he simply said, "Thank you, for today, for what he told you in the garden. It is more than he has given anyone in a very long time." "He's a good boy," Grace said softly. "He's just scared. Whatever he saw that night, it left a mark on him that words alone probably cannot fix. But I think in time, with patience, he'll find his voice again. All of it, not just pieces." "I hope you are right," Dante said, and for the briefest moment, something almost gentle passed across his face before the guarded mask slipped back into place. "Good night, Miss Bellamy." "Good night," Grace answered, and she watched him disappear back into his study before she finally continued on toward the kitchen, her mind full of grieving children and dangerous men, and a promise she intended to keep no matter what shadows waited beyond the garden walls. She did not sleep easily that night, her thoughts circling back again and again to Leo's whispered words in the sunlit garden, to the fear in his eyes, to the unfinished sentence he had not been ready to complete. Someone had told him to hide. Someone had wanted him silent. And somewhere beyond the tall iron gates of the Morty estate, that someone was still out there, watching, waiting, and far too patient for Grace's comfort. But as frightened as she was, she found something steady inside herself as well, a quiet resolve that had nothing to do with the salary she was being paid or the grand house she now called home. She thought of the little boy's hand in hers, of the small drawing with 2 figures standing outside a house with no windows, and she understood with total certainty that she was not simply passing through this family's life. She was becoming part of its story, whether she had planned to or not. The scream that tore through the garden made Grace drop the book in her hands and run before she even understood why. It was Leo's voice, high and frightened, coming from behind the hedges near the old fountain, and her heart slammed against her ribs as she rounded the corner expecting the worst. But it was only a fallen bird, small and broken-winged, lying beneath the fountain's edge, and Leo was kneeling beside it, tears streaming down his face, his hands hovering helplessly over the trembling creature. "It's hurt," he said, his voice shaking. It can't fly, Grace." Relief flooded through her so fast she nearly laughed, though she kept her face serious for his sake. She knelt beside him carefully, her knees pressing into the soft grass. "Let's see if we can help it, okay? Can you find something soft like a cloth or a leaf, so we can move it without hurting it more?" Leo nodded quickly, wiping his face with his sleeve before running toward a nearby bush to gather large leaves. Grace watched him go, her chest still tight from the scare, and marveled quietly at how far he had come in just a few weeks. 2 months ago, he would not have spoken at all. Now he was crying over an injured bird and asking for her help without hesitation. Together they made a small nest from the leaves and carried the bird carefully to a quiet corner of the garden shed, away from the cats that sometimes wandered the grounds. Leo watched over it with the seriousness of a much older child, checking on it every few minutes, whispering soft words of comfort to it that Grace pretended not to hear. "You're very good with him," a voice said from behind her, and she turned to find Dante standing at the edge of the garden path, watching the two of them with an expression she had not seen on his face before, something soft around the eyes. "He's good with the bird," Grace said, smiling. "He has a kind heart." "He gets that from his mother," Dante said quietly, then seemed surprised he had said it out loud. He cleared his throat and looked away toward the roses. "I do not speak of her much. It is easier that way." "You don't have to avoid it around me," Grace said gently. "If you ever want to talk about her, for Leo's sake or your own, I'm happy to listen." Dante was quiet for a long moment, watching his son whisper to the injured bird. Her name was Isabella. She used to say this garden needed more color, more life. She planted half of these roses herself. He paused. "After she died, I almost had them all pulled out. I could not stand looking at them. But Leo used to help her water them, and I could not bring myself to take that memory away from him too." Grace felt her throat tighten at the quiet grief in his voice, a grief he clearly kept locked away most of the time, buried beneath the hard business of running his world. "I'm glad you kept them," she said softly. "I think memories like that matter more than we realize, especially for children." Dante looked at her then, really looked at her, in a way that made her suddenly aware of how close they were standing. "You understand more about my son in a few weeks than most people understand about anything in years," he said. "I am not sure how to thank you properly for that." "You don't need to thank me," Grace said, though warmth rose in her cheeks under his gaze. "Watching him heal is thanks enough." Their conversation was interrupted by Leo's small voice calling out that the bird had moved its wing, and both adults turned toward him at once, some of the tension easing from the moment as they focused instead on the boy's small triumph. But Grace noticed, even as she smiled and praised Leo's careful patience, that Dante's eyes lingered on her a moment longer than necessary before he finally looked away. Over the following days, Grace noticed the household beginning to feel different, warmer somehow, as if Leo's small steps toward healing were thawing something in the entire house. Marta hummed while she cooked. The guards nodded more easily when Grace passed. Even Dante seemed to find small reasons to appear near the garden or the playroom in the evenings, lingering a little longer than his busy schedule should have allowed. One evening, after Leo had fallen asleep with the recovering bird's small cage sitting proudly on his windowsill, Grace found Dante sitting alone on the back terrace, a glass of untouched wine in front of him, his eyes distant. "May I sit?" she asked. He gestured to the chair beside him without a word, and she took it, letting the silence stretch comfortably between them for a while before he finally spoke. "I used to sit out here with Isabella every night," he said. "After Leo was born, this became our place once he was finally asleep, just a few minutes to breathe before the next day started." He paused, turning the wine glass slowly in his fingers. "I have not sat here since she died, not until tonight." "What made tonight different?" Grace asked quietly. Dante considered the question for a long time before answering. "I think I finally have something worth breathing for again. Watching him tonight, holding that bird's cage like it was the most important thing in the world, laughing when it chirped at him. I had almost forgotten what that sounded like, his laugh." Grace's heart ached softly at his words, and she found herself reaching out almost without thinking to rest her hand briefly over his on the table. "He has a long way to go still, but he's going to be okay. I truly believe that." Dante looked down at her hand, then up at her face, something shifting behind his guarded eyes. "I believe it too now, because of you." The moment stretched between them, warm and fragile, until the distant sound of a car engine broke it apart. Dante's entire posture changed instantly, the softness disappearing, replaced by sharp alertness as he rose from his chair and moved toward the edge of the terrace, scanning the driveway below. "Expecting someone?" Grace asked, standing as well, her earlier warmth replaced by unease. "No," Dante said grimly, "I am not." The car slowed near the front gate but did not enter, its headlights washing briefly across the stone wall before it continued on down the road and disappeared into the darkness. Dante stood still for a long moment, watching the empty road, his jaw tight. "Has that happened before?" Grace asked carefully. "More than I would like," he admitted. "My security believes someone has been mapping the property, learning the guard rotations, watching when Leo is outside and when he is not. We have not identified who yet, but I have my suspicions." "The Calloway family," Grace said, remembering pieces of conversation she had overheard in recent weeks, names mentioned in tense phone calls behind closed doors. Dante's eyes snapped to hers, surprised she knew the name. "You have been listening carefully." "I care about Leo," Grace said simply. "If there's danger near him, I want to understand it, not hide from it." Dante studied her for a long moment, something like respect flickering behind his tired eyes. "The Calloways have wanted territory that belongs to my family for 2 generations. My father held them off. I have held them off. But Isabella's death was not an accident, Grace. I have never truly believed that, no matter what the official reports claimed. And if they are willing to take a mother from her son once, I do not trust them not to try something else, especially now that Leo is starting to remember things from that night." The weight of his words settled heavily over the terrace. Grace thought of Leo's whispered confession in the garden weeks ago, the fear in his small voice as he spoke of hiding, and a cold worry twisted through her stomach. "What do we do?" she asked. "We stay careful," Dante said. "We stay close, and we do not let him out of sight, not for a moment, not until I know exactly who is watching this house and why." From that night forward, Grace noticed small changes in the household's rhythm. More guards walked the perimeter. Marta stopped sending deliveries through the side gate, insisting everything come through the front where cameras could record it clearly. Dante began coming home earlier, spending more evenings in the garden with Leo and Grace instead of locked away in his study. Despite the growing tension, or perhaps because of it, something continued to grow between Grace and Dante as well, quiet and careful, built from shared worry over a small boy's healing and stolen moments on the terrace after Leo had gone to sleep. Grace found herself looking forward to those evenings more than she wanted to admit. The way Dante's guarded expression softened slightly whenever she made him laugh, which was rare, but not as rare as it had been when she first arrived. One afternoon, while walking with Leo through the garden, the boy suddenly stopped near the roses and looked up at her with serious eyes. "Do you like my father?" he asked, the question so direct it caught her completely off guard. "I think your father is a good man who loves you very much," Grace said carefully, choosing her words with care. Leo considered this answer seriously, the way he considered most things now that he had found his voice again. "I think he likes you too," he said matter-of-factly, then turned back to the roses as if he had not just upended Grace's careful composure entirely. She did not know how to respond, so she simply smiled and let the moment pass, though her heart beat a little faster for the rest of the afternoon. That evening, after another quiet dinner and another gentle bedtime routine, Grace found Dante waiting for her near the top of the stairs, his expression more open than she had ever seen it. "Leo told me something interesting today," he said, a small, rare smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "He seems to think I like you." Grace felt her cheeks warm instantly. Children say all sorts of things. He is usually right about people, Dante said, stepping a little closer. He was right about you from the very first day, even when he could not say it in words. The air between them felt charged, full of things unspoken, until the distant crackle of a radio interrupted them, one of the guards calling in a routine check from the front gate. Dante's expression sharpened instantly, the moment slipping away as duty pulled his attention back toward the dangers still circling their world. "Get some rest," he said softly, though his eyes lingered on her a moment longer than necessary. "Tomorrow I want to take Leo and you somewhere outside the estate, just for a few hours. He has been asking to see the lake near the old orchard. It might be good for him, good for all of us, to remember there is still life beyond these walls." Grace agreed, though a small worry stirred in her chest even as she smiled and said good night. Something about leaving the protected walls of the estate, even for a peaceful afternoon at a lake, felt like stepping into uncertain territory, especially with unknown watchers still circling somewhere in the shadows beyond the gate. The next morning arrived bright and warm, the kind of day that seemed to erase the tension of the previous night simply by being so ordinary and pleasant. Leo woke early, practically bouncing with excitement about the promised trip to the lake, chattering to Grace about the fish he hoped to see and the skipping stones he planned to collect along the shore. It was strange and wonderful to hear him speak so freely, his words tumbling over each other the way most children's did, none of the careful hesitation that had marked his speech even a few weeks earlier. "Do you think there will be ducks?" he asked, tugging on Grace's sleeve as she helped him into his jacket. "I think there will definitely be ducks," Grace said, smiling at his enthusiasm. "And maybe, if we're lucky, some very greedy fish who like bread crumbs." Marta packed a basket of sandwiches and fruit for the outing, muttering under her breath about how it was good to see some sunshine in this house again, though she cast a worried glance toward the guards near the gate as she handed the basket to Grace. Even the staff, Grace realized, carried the weight of the danger circling the family, even on days that felt as light and easy as this one. Dante joined them at the front steps dressed more casually than Grace had ever seen him, in a simple gray sweater instead of his usual sharp suit, looking almost like an ordinary father for the first time since she had arrived. 2 guards would follow at a careful distance, he explained, close enough to respond quickly but far enough to let Leo feel like the day belonged only to them. The drive to the lake took nearly an hour, winding through quiet country roads lined with tall trees just beginning to turn gold at their edges. Leo pressed his face to the window for most of the ride, pointing out cows and horses in distant fields, his voice bright with the simple joy of being outside the estate walls for the first time in months. When they arrived, the lake stretched wide and calm beneath the autumn sun, its surface catching the light in silver ripples. Leo ran ahead toward the water's edge, his laughter carrying back to them on the breeze, and Grace felt something warm and full bloom in her chest at the sight of him running so freely, so unlike the frightened, silent boy she had met weeks earlier. "Thank you for this," Dante said quietly, walking beside her as they followed at a slower pace. "I had almost forgotten what it looked like, watching him be simply happy, without fear shadowing every moment." "He's a different boy than the one I met," Grace agreed. "Not completely healed, not yet, but different. Lighter." "Because of you," Dante said again, the way he often did now, though this time his voice carried something deeper, something that made Grace's pulse quicken slightly. They spent the afternoon skipping stones and feeding the small flock of ducks that gathered eagerly near the shore, Leo's laughter ringing out again and again as he tried, and mostly failed, to make his stones bounce properly across the water. Dante showed him the correct technique, crouching low, his usually guarded expression completely open as he guided his son's hand through the motion, and Grace found herself watching the two of them with an ache of tenderness she had not expected to feel so strongly. As the afternoon began to fade into early evening, Leo wandered a little further down the shoreline, chasing a duck that had wandered too close to the water's edge, and Grace called after him gently to stay within sight. Dante watched his son with a small, contented smile, before turning to Grace with an expression more serious than the moment seemed to call for. "I have not felt this at ease in a very long time," he admitted. "Not since before Isabella died. I did not think I would feel this way again, not truly, not without guilt attached to it." "You're allowed to be happy, Dante," Grace said softly. "Grief and joy can exist together. They don't cancel each other out." He looked at her for a long moment, the golden light of the setting sun catching the sharp lines of his face, softening them somehow. "You have a way of saying exactly what I need to hear, even when I do not know I need to hear it." Before either of them could say anything more, one of the guards approached quickly from the tree line, his expression tense in a way that immediately shattered the peaceful mood of the afternoon. He spoke low words to Dante, too quiet for Grace to hear clearly, but she saw Dante's entire body go rigid, his hand moving instinctively toward his jacket. "What is it?" Grace asked, fear rising sharply in her chest. "A car has been parked near the entrance road for the last 20 minutes, Dante said grimly, already scanning the tree line surrounding the lake. "Not moving, watching." Grace's eyes flew immediately to Leo, still crouched near the water's edge, oblivious to the sudden tension gripping the adults behind him. "We need to get him back to the car," she said, already moving. Dante caught her arm gently but urgently. "Stay calm. Walk normally. We do not want him frightened, not yet, not until we know if this is truly a threat or simply a coincidence." They walked together toward Leo, forcing their voices into casual, easy tones as they called him back from the shore, telling him it was time to head home before it got too dark to see the road properly. Leo came willingly, still chattering about the ducks, completely unaware of the tension humming beneath the adults' calm expressions. But as they walked back toward the car, Grace could not shake the cold feeling settling over her, the same instinct that had warned her weeks ago in the quiet hallway outside Dante's study. Something was wrong. Something was watching. And whatever peace they had found that afternoon by the water's edge was about to be tested in ways none of them were fully prepared for. She could not have known, as she lay awake that night listening to the wind move through Isabella's roses below her window, just how right that worry would turn out to be. The black sedan appeared out of nowhere, cutting sharply into the lane behind them just as Grace turned onto the quiet road leading away from the market square. Her hands tightened instantly on the wheel, every instinct screaming that something was wrong before her mind had even caught up to why. "Leo, put your seatbelt back on properly," she said, keeping her voice steady even as her heart began to pound. "It's already on," Leo said from the back seat, his voice small and confused as he noticed the tension suddenly filling the car. Grace checked the mirror again. The sedan had closed the distance between them, matching her speed exactly, far too close for a normal driver simply heading in the same direction. She thought of everything Dante had told her, about watchers, about careful timing, about the Calloway family circling patiently for any opportunity to strike at his weakest point. His son. "Grace, why is that car so close?" Leo asked, his voice rising with fear now, and Grace forced herself to sound calm even as her mind raced through every option available to her. "It's probably nothing, sweetheart, but I'm going to drive a little faster, okay? I need you to hold on tight and stay very still for me." She turned sharply at the next intersection, watching the sedan follow without hesitation, any pretense of coincidence gone now. Her pulse hammered in her ears as she reached for the phone Dante had given her weeks earlier, pressing the single button that connected directly to his security line, her eyes flicking constantly between the road ahead and the mirror behind her. "This is Grace," she said the moment the line connected, her voice tight but controlled. "We're being followed. Black sedan, tinted windows, it's been on us since the market." The voice on the other end sharpened instantly into focused urgency. "What is your location?" She rattled off the street names as she turned again, deliberately choosing a route that wound through narrower streets, hoping to lose the sedan among the tighter turns and slower traffic of the town center. But the driver behind her seemed to anticipate every move, staying close, patient, almost as if they knew exactly where she would turn before she turned there. "They're not backing off," she said into the phone, fear threading sharply through her words now. "Head toward the church on Miller Street," the voice instructed. "We have a team 3 minutes out. Do not stop for anything, do not roll down your windows, and keep the boy low in his seat." "Leo, sweetheart, I need you to unbuckle for just a second and get down low on the floor, okay? Like we're playing a hiding game." Leo's eyes were wide with terror now, tears gathering at their edges, but he obeyed instantly, sliding down between the seats as Grace had asked, his small body trembling. "Are the bad people from before back?" he whispered, and Grace's chest ached with fury at the question, at the fact that a child so young already understood what it meant to have enemies. "I won't let anything happen to you," Grace said fiercely, her eyes fixed on the road ahead even as the sedan pulled dangerously close behind them. "I promise you that, Leo. I promise." She pressed harder on the accelerator, weaving through the narrow streets with a focus she did not know she possessed. Years of careful, patient nannying replaced suddenly by something fierce and protective that had nothing to do with training and everything to do with the small boy hiding on the floor of her car. The church spire came into view ahead, and behind it, the welcome flash of 2 dark cars moving fast toward her position. The sedan behind her seemed to notice the approaching vehicles at the same moment, suddenly veering off at the next side street and disappearing before Dante's men could close the distance. Grace's hands were shaking so badly she could barely keep them steady on the wheel as she pulled to a stop near the church, her breath coming in short, ragged gasps. The guards reached her car within seconds, one of them pulling open her door while the other checked the surrounding street with sharp, practiced eyes. "Are you both all right?" the first guard asked urgently. "We're okay," Grace managed, though her voice trembled. She turned immediately to the back seat, reaching down to gently lift Leo back onto the seat, wrapping her arms around him as he finally broke into frightened sobs against her shoulder. "You did so well, Leo. You did exactly right." By the time they arrived back at the estate, Dante was already standing at the top of the front steps, his face pale with a fear Grace had never seen on him before, not even the night the car had slowed near the gate. He crossed the distance between them in seconds, pulling Leo into his arms and holding him tightly, his eyes closing briefly as if in silent prayer of relief. "He's not hurt," Grace said quickly, "frightened but not hurt. I got him down low the moment I realized we were being followed." Dante looked at her over Leo's shoulder, something raw and grateful passing across his features. "You saved him," he said quietly. "You kept your head and you saved him." "I did what anyone would have done," Grace said, though her hands were still shaking from the adrenaline still coursing through her body. "No," Dante said firmly, carrying Leo inside as Grace followed close behind. "Not anyone would have done that. Most people panic. Most people freeze. You did neither." Inside, Marta fussed over Leo with warm blankets and a cup of something sweet to calm his nerves, while Dante pulled Grace aside into the study, his expression a mixture of fury and fear that seemed to war constantly behind his dark eyes. "I should never have let you take him into town alone," he said, pacing the length of the room. "I have been careless, thinking that a few extra guards near the gate would be enough. I was wrong. They are getting bolder, Grace, and I nearly lost him because of my own mistakes." "You didn't lose him," Grace said firmly, stepping into his path to stop his pacing. "He's upstairs right now, safe, because we both did what needed to be done. Blaming yourself doesn't change what almost happened. It only stops you from figuring out what to do next." Dante stopped pacing, looking at her with something like surprise at the strength in her voice. "You are not afraid to speak plainly to me, are you? Most people in my life choose their words very carefully around me." "I'm not most people," Grace said simply. "And right now, Leo doesn't need someone who's careful with words. He needs people who will keep him safe and help him feel steady again after what just happened." Something shifted in Dante's expression, gratitude mixing with an emotion that ran deeper still, something Grace recognized because she felt an answering echo of it in her own chest. "I want you to have full protection from now on," he said. "Whenever you leave this house, wherever you go, someone will be with you. I cannot lose you too, Grace. Not after everything you have given this family already." The words hung between them, heavier than either of them had perhaps intended, and Grace felt her breath catch slightly at the raw honesty behind them. "I'm not leaving," she said softly. "Not because of some car following us today. Leo needs consistency now more than ever, and so, I think, do you." Dante reached out, his hand finding hers gently, his thumb tracing careful patterns over her knuckles as he studied her face intently. "You are the strongest person I have ever known," he said quietly. "And I am terrified, every single day now, that this world I live in will take you from us the way it took Isabella." "Then let's make sure it doesn't," Grace said, her voice steady despite the fear still lingering in her chest from the afternoon's terror. "Let's find out who's behind this, and let's stop them together." Over the following days, the estate transformed into something closer to a fortress. More guards arrived, patrolling not just the perimeter but the interior hallways as well. Cameras were added to every entrance. Leo was no longer permitted outside the walls at all, a restriction that clearly frustrated the boy even as he understood, in his own quiet way, why it had become necessary. Grace spent hours each day trying to keep his spirits high despite the sudden confinement, turning the garden into an adventure land of hidden treasures and pretend expeditions, determined not to let fear steal back the joy he had only recently rediscovered. But she noticed, too, the toll the increased tension took on Dante, who grew quieter, more watchful, spending long hours locked in meetings with men Grace did not recognize, their voices low and urgent behind the study's heavy door. One evening, nearly a week after the incident with the sedan, Dante's head of security, a stern man named Victor Callahan, requested a private meeting with Grace as well, wanting to understand every detail of what she had witnessed that day. She recounted everything carefully, the timing, the route she had taken, the moment she first noticed the sedan, watching Victor's expression grow increasingly grim as she spoke. "The route you took was not predictable," Victor said finally, half to himself. "Which means either this was pure luck on their part, or someone gave them your schedule in advance." The implications settled over the room like a heavy fog. Someone inside the household, someone with access to Grace's routines, might be feeding information to the very people threatening Leo's life. "Who would have known our route that day?" Grace asked, a chill moving through her despite the warm evening air. "That," Victor said grimly, "is exactly what I intend to find out." Dante's expression, when Victor left to begin his investigation, was harder than Grace had ever seen it, a cold fury simmering just beneath his controlled exterior. "If someone in this house has betrayed us," he said quietly, "they will regret it deeply. No one threatens my son and walks away from it unpunished." Grace said nothing, but she felt the weight of his words settle over her, understanding for the first time just how dangerous the world truly was that she had stepped into, and how close, how terribly close, they had all come that afternoon to losing something far more precious than any of them were willing to say aloud. That night, after Leo had finally fallen into an exhausted, fitful sleep, Grace sat beside his bed for a long while, watching him breathe, thinking of his small hand gripping hers in the back of the car, of his whispered question about the bad people coming back. She thought of Isabella's roses blooming steadily in the garden below, a mother's love outliving her, protecting her son in small, quiet ways even after death. And she made a silent vow, sitting there in the dim light of his room, that whoever was hunting this family would have to go through her first, before they ever got close enough to hurt this little boy again. The following morning brought a strange stillness to the house, the kind of quiet that comes after fear has settled into routine rather than panic. Grace woke early, dressed quickly, and made her way down to the kitchen, where she found Marta already at work, kneading dough with more force than the task seemed to require. "You look like you didn't sleep either," Grace said gently, taking a seat at the counter. Marta glanced up, her eyes tired but sharp. "This house has seen too much sorrow already. I keep thinking of that poor boy, hiding on the floor of your car like some kind of criminal fleeing the law, when all he wanted was to feed a few ducks." She shook her head, pressing her palms hard into the dough. "I have worked for this family since before Leo was born. I remember when Isabella used to sing in this kitchen while I cooked. I never thought I would see fear like this return to these walls." "We're going to figure out who's responsible," Grace said, trying to sound more certain than she felt. "Victor is already looking into it." "Victor is a good man," Marta said, "but even good men can miss what is standing right in front of them if they do not want to see it." She said nothing more on the subject, though her words lingered uneasily in Grace's mind for the rest of the morning. Grace spent the day trying to keep Leo distracted from the tension that clung to every corner of the house, setting up a small pretend campsite in the living room using cushions and blankets, letting him tell elaborate stories about brave explorers discovering hidden treasures in faraway lands. For a few hours at least, his laughter returned, bright and unguarded, and Grace held onto the sound of it like something precious. But even as she played along, part of her mind remained alert, watching the staff who moved quietly through the house, wondering, with a discomfort she did not want to admit, whether one of the familiar faces around her might be the very person who had betrayed Leo's safety to strangers waiting outside the gates. That evening, Dante found her in the garden after Leo had gone to bed, the roses swaying gently in the cool night air around them. He looked exhausted, dark circles shadowing his eyes, but there was a steadiness in his expression that had not been there earlier in the week. "Victor has narrowed the list of people who knew our route that day," he said quietly. "It is smaller than I would like, smaller and closer to home than I want to admit." "Do you have a name yet?" Grace asked, her stomach tightening. "Not yet," Dante admitted, "but soon, and when I do, I promise you this house will be safe again." He reached for her hand in the darkness, his fingers warm and steady around hers. "Whatever happens next, Grace, I need you to know how grateful I am that you did not run the moment danger showed itself. Most people would have quit that very day." "I told you before," Grace said softly, meeting his eyes in the moonlight. "I'm not most people. And I am not going anywhere, not while Leo still needs me, not while this family still needs to feel like it can heal." Dante studied her for a long moment, something tender and fierce passing behind his tired eyes, before he simply nodded, as if her words had settled something deep within him that he had needed to hear for a very long time. They stood together in the quiet garden, the weight of the coming danger still heavy around them, but for that one still moment, wrapped in the scent of Isabella's roses and the fragile hope of healing, neither of them felt quite so alone in facing whatever storm was still gathering beyond the gates. Before Grace could return inside for the night, Victor appeared at the edge of the terrace, his face grim in the lamplight. "A word, if I may," he said, glancing briefly at Dante before continuing. "We traced the signal that alerted the sedan to your route. It came from a phone registered inside this house, though the number itself was discarded shortly after the incident." Dante's expression turned to stone. "Whose phone, Victor?" "We do not know yet," Victor admitted. "The device was a burner purchased with cash, but the timing tells us it was activated from somewhere within these walls, likely by someone who had access to Grace's schedule that morning." He hesitated before adding, "It could be one of the newer staff, Or it could be someone who has worked here for years and simply grown desperate, or greedy, or afraid enough of the Callaways to comply with their demands. Grace felt a cold unease settle over her at the thought that someone she passed in the hallway each day, someone who perhaps smiled at her over breakfast or helped carry Leo's laundry, might be the very person who had put his life in danger. "How do we find out who it was?" she asked. "Carefully," Victor said. "If we move too quickly, whoever is responsible may panic and either flee or, worse, attempt something more drastic before we can stop them. I recommend we continue as normal for now, while I quietly narrow the list further. No one outside this conversation should know what we have discovered tonight." Dante nodded slowly, though the fury in his eyes had not diminished in the slightest. "Watch everyone," he said. "Trust no one completely until we have a name." Victor departed to continue his quiet investigation, leaving Dante and Grace alone once more beneath the darkened sky. Dante turned to her, his expression softer now, though shadowed with the fresh weight of Victor's news. "I am sorry," he said quietly. "I brought you into a house where you cannot even trust the people who serve you breakfast. That is no way for anyone to live, least of all someone who has done nothing but bring light back into this family." "I chose to stay, Dante," Grace said firmly, "knowing the risks, and I would choose it again even now, knowing there's someone close to us who cannot be trusted. Leo needs steadiness more than ever, and I intend to be exactly that for him, no matter who is watching from the shadows." Dante reached for her hand once more, holding it gently in the cool night air, and for a long moment neither of them spoke, the unspoken fear of betrayal from within settling quietly over the garden, alongside the fragile, growing warmth between them, both truths existing together as the night deepened around the sleeping house. The lights went out all at once, plunging the entire house into sudden, breathless darkness, and Grace's first thought, sharp and instant, was Leo. She was already moving before the second alarm sounded, racing down the hallway toward his room with her heart slamming against her ribs, every instinct screaming that this was not a simple power failure. Shouts echoed from somewhere below, urgent and overlapping, and through the window at the end of the hall she caught a glimpse of dark shapes moving fast across the lawn, too many of them, too coordinated to be anything but exactly what she feared. She burst into Leo's room to find him already sitting up in bed, eyes wide with terror in the dim moonlight filtering through the curtains. "Grace, what's happening?" he whispered, his voice trembling. "We need to hide right now," Grace said, forcing her voice into calm, steady control even as panic clawed at her chest. She had gone over this exact scenario in her mind more than once since Victor's warning weeks earlier, memorizing the layout of the house, planning quietly for the possibility she had prayed would never come. "Remember the hiding game we played in the car? We're going to play it again, but bigger this time. Can you be brave for me?" Leo nodded quickly, his small hands gripping hers as she pulled him from the bed and toward the reading nook built into the wall of his closet, a space Grace had noticed weeks ago and quietly resolved to remember, just in case. She pushed aside the hanging clothes, guided him inside, and pressed a finger to her lips. "No matter what you hear," she whispered, "you stay right here, completely silent, until I come back for you or until you hear your father's voice. Do you understand?" "Don't leave me," Leo whimpered, tears streaking down his face. "I'm not going far," Grace promised, her own voice breaking slightly despite her best efforts to stay strong for him. "I need to make sure this room looks empty, so no one thinks to look for you here. I will be right outside this door the entire time." She closed the closet carefully, arranged the bedding to look undisturbed, and grabbed the heavy iron bookend from Leo's shelf, gripping it tightly in her trembling hand as she positioned herself in the shadowed corner of the room nearest the closet, her back pressed against the wall, listening. Footsteps sounded in the hallway outside, heavy and unfamiliar, accompanied by low voices speaking in clipped, urgent tones that were not the voices of Dante's usual guards. Grace's breath caught in her throat as the door handle turned slowly, and a man she did not recognize stepped into the room, a flashlight beam sweeping across the empty bed, the untouched pillows, the closed curtains. Grace held perfectly still in the shadows, every muscle in her body screaming with tension, praying silently that Leo remained as quiet as she had asked, that his small breaths inside the closet stayed hidden beneath the pounding of her own heart. The man's flashlight paused on the closet door for one agonizing moment, and Grace tightened her grip on the bookend, prepared to do whatever it took to protect the child hiding just feet away from a stranger's reach. Then, from somewhere down the hall, a shout rang out, sharp with alarm, and the man in the doorway turned and hurried away, drawn by whatever commotion had erupted elsewhere in the house. Grace released a shaking breath, her whole body trembling with the effort of staying silent, but she did not move from her position, not yet, not until she was certain the immediate danger had passed. Minutes stretched by like hours. She heard more shouting, the distant crack of something that made her stomach twist with fear, though she forced herself not to imagine what it might mean. Finally, familiar voices reached her ears, Victor's voice, sharp and commanding, calling her name through the hallway with barely restrained urgency. "In here," she called back, her voice hoarse. "We're in here." Victor appeared in the doorway seconds later, relief washing visibly across his usually stoic face when he saw her standing safely in the shadows. "Is the boy with you?" "He's hidden," Grace said, already moving toward the closet with shaking hands. She pulled the door open gently to find Leo curled into the smallest possible space, tears streaming silently down his face, his small body trembling violently. "It's okay now, sweetheart. You did so well. You were so brave." Leo threw himself into her arms, sobbing openly now that the danger had passed, and Grace held him tightly, her own tears finally falling as the adrenaline that had kept her steady throughout the ordeal began to drain away, leaving her shaking in its wake. Dante arrived moments later, having been pulled from an emergency meeting in the city the instant the alarm was triggered, his face pale with a terror Grace had never seen on him before. He crossed the room in 3 long strides, gathering both Grace and Leo into his arms at once, his whole body trembling with relief. "I am here," he said, his voice breaking. "I am here, both of you are safe, I am here." Downstairs, the aftermath of the attack came into sharp, grim focus as the household began to assess the damage. 2 of the intruders had been caught by Dante's security team, the rest fleeing back over the estate walls the moment reinforcements arrived. No one on the household staff had been seriously hurt, though several guards nursed bruises and cuts from the brief, violent confrontation that had erupted near the eastern wing. But the most devastating discovery came an hour later, when Victor pulled Dante aside with an expression of barely controlled fury, revealing what his careful investigation had finally uncovered. The burner phone that had alerted the Calloway family to Grace's route weeks earlier had been traced, at last, to its source, a source far closer to Dante than anyone had wanted to believe. "It was Marta's nephew," Victor said grimly. "The young man who has been helping in the kitchen the past few months. He owed money to men connected to the Calloway family, gambling debts he could not repay. They offered to clear his debt in exchange for information about the household's routines." Dante's face turned to stone, a cold, terrible fury settling over his features that made even Victor take a small step back. "Where is he now?" "Detained," Victor said. "He gave up the information easily once confronted, terrified of what would happen to him otherwise. He claims he never intended for anyone to be hurt, only meant to pay off his debt quietly." "He nearly got my son killed," Dante said, his voice dangerously quiet. "Intentions do not undo consequences." Grace, standing nearby with Leo still clinging to her side, felt a wave of complicated emotion at the news, sympathy for a desperate young man caught in circumstances larger than himself, warring with fury at the danger his choices had brought to Leo's door. She thought of Marta, who had trusted her family enough to bring her nephew into this fragile, healing household, and her heart ached at the pain this discovery would bring to a woman who had already suffered so much loss alongside this family. Marta herself arrived moments later, having heard the commotion from her quarters, her face crumbling into horror as Victor explained, gently but firmly, what her nephew had done. "I did not know," she whispered, tears streaming down her weathered face. "I swear to you, Dante, I did not know what he had done, if I had suspected even for a moment." "I know, Marta," Dante said, some of the fury softening slightly as he looked at the woman who had served his family faithfully for decades. "This is not your burden to carry. But he cannot remain in this house, not after tonight." Marta nodded through her tears, understanding without needing further explanation, and Grace felt her own heart break a little at the sight of the older woman's grief, caught between loyalty to family and the safety of the household she had devoted her life to protecting. Later that night, once Leo had finally been coaxed into an exhausted, fitful sleep in Dante's own bedroom, refusing to be separated from his father even for a moment, Grace found herself standing alone on the terrace, staring out at the garden where Isabella's roses swayed gently in the cool night breeze, seemingly untouched by the violence that had nearly torn through the house hours earlier. Dante joined her there eventually, his expression exhausted but calmer now that the immediate crisis had passed. "You saved him again," he said quietly, coming to stand beside her at the railing. "If you had not thought to hide him, if you had panicked even for a moment." "I didn't panic," Grace said softly, though her hands still trembled faintly at the memory of the flashlight beam sweeping across that closet door. "I just kept thinking about how scared he must be, and it made me more determined not to let that fear win." Dante turned to face her fully, his eyes searching hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. "Grace, I have spent months now trying to convince myself that what I feel for you is simply gratitude, simply relief that Leo finally has someone who understands him. But tonight, watching you willing to face armed men to protect my son, I cannot pretend any longer that it is only gratitude I feel." Grace's heart pounded fiercely in her chest, the weight of his words settling over her with a warmth that momentarily pushed back the lingering fear of the night's events. "Dante, I know this is not the right moment," he continued, his voice rough with emotion. "I know we are standing here in the aftermath of an attack, that Leo is finally healing but still has so far to go, that my world is dangerous and complicated and asks so much of anyone who chooses to stand beside it. But I needed you to know, before anything else happens, that what I feel for you is real, Grace. It has been real for weeks now, growing quietly beneath everything else." Grace reached for his hand, her own trembling slightly, though not entirely from fear anymore. "I feel it too," she admitted softly. "I have felt it for a while now, though I told myself it was not the time to think about such things, not with everything happening around Leo. Perhaps it is never the perfect time in a life like mine," Dante said quietly, his thumb tracing gentle patterns over her knuckles the way he had done once before in the study, weeks ago, when the danger had felt distant and abstract rather than terrifyingly real. "But tonight showed me how quickly everything can be taken away. I do not want to waste any more time pretending. I do not feel what I feel for you." They stood together in the quiet garden for a long while after that, the roses swaying softly around them, the terror of the night slowly settling into something steadier, something that felt, despite everything, like the beginning of healing rather than the ending of it. But even as hope bloomed quietly between them, Grace could not fully shake the knowledge that the Calloway family had not simply given up after one failed attack. Somewhere beyond the estate walls, they were surely already planning their next move, and the fragile peace this family had begun to rebuild remained far from secure. The following days passed in a strange blend of healing and heightened caution. Leo refused to sleep in his own room for nearly a week, insisting instead on a small bed set up beside his father's, and neither Dante nor Grace had the heart to push him toward independence before he was ready. Grace spent long hours simply sitting with him, letting him talk through his fear in small pieces, praising every brave word he managed to share about that terrifying night. "I heard the man's flashlight," Leo confided one afternoon, curled beside her on the window seat overlooking the garden. "I was so scared he would open the door. I held my breath so long my chest hurt." "You did exactly the right thing," Grace told him gently. "Holding still, staying quiet, trusting me to keep you safe. That took real courage, Leo. More courage than a lot of grown men would have shown in that same moment." Leo considered this seriously, the way he considered most things now. Are the bad people going to come back? Grace chose her words carefully, unwilling to lie to him but equally unwilling to feed his fear further. "Your father and Victor are working very hard to make sure that does not happen again, and no matter what, I promise you, I will always do everything I can to keep you safe. You are not facing any of this alone." Meanwhile, Victor's investigation expanded beyond the household, tracing the captured intruders back through a chain of associates that led, layer by layer, toward the heart of the Callaway organization itself. Dante spent long hours locked away with his most trusted men, planning a response that would not simply defend against the next attack, but end the threat permanently. "They will not stop until either their family loses everything, or mine does," Dante told Grace one evening, his voice heavy with the weight of decisions no father should have to make. "I have spent years trying to hold the line without expanding the conflict further, but after tonight, I no longer believe restraint will keep Leo safe." "What are you planning to do?" Grace asked, worry threading through her voice. "Whatever it takes," Dante said simply, and something in the hard set of his jaw told her he meant those words completely, that the careful, guarded man she had first met months ago had been replaced by something fiercer, something willing to risk everything to finally secure lasting safety for his son. Grace did not ask further, understanding instinctively that some parts of Dante's world remained beyond her place to question, though she trusted, with a certainty that surprised her, that whatever choices he made in the coming days would be driven entirely by his desperate love for the boy sleeping safely just down the hall. Whatever storm was still gathering beyond the estate walls, she intended to remain steady beside this family through all of it, for Leo's sake, and increasingly, for her own heart's sake as well. A few nights later, Marta appeared quietly at Grace's door, her eyes swollen from days of crying, a small parcel wrapped in cloth held tightly in her hands. "I am leaving in the morning," she said softly. "Dante has been kind enough to let me go with dignity, but I cannot stay in this house any longer, not after what my own family brought to its door." "You don't have to leave, Marta," Grace said gently, stepping aside to let the older woman into the room. "None of this was your fault." "Perhaps not directly," Marta said, sitting heavily on the edge of Grace's bed, "but I brought him into this house. I trusted him with information I should have guarded more carefully, simply because he was blood. That trust nearly cost that little boy his life." She unwrapped the parcel in her hands, revealing a small, faded photograph of a younger Isabella laughing in the very garden that now held her roses. "I want you to have this." Isabella would have wanted someone who truly loves her son to keep it safe. Grace took the photograph with trembling hands, moved beyond words by the gesture. "Thank you, Marta. I promise I will take good care of it, and of him." "I know you will," Marta said, patting Grace's hand with the same warmth she had shown from that very first breakfast weeks ago, when she had quietly slipped an extra biscuit onto Grace's plate. "You are good for this family, Grace Bellamy, better than you perhaps realize. Do not let fear, yours or anyone else's, convince you to leave before you have seen this story through to its proper ending." Long after Marta had returned to her own room to finish packing, Grace sat alone with the small photograph, studying Isabella's warm, laughing face, feeling the quiet weight of responsibility settle over her once more. She thought of Leo's whispered fears, of Dante's fierce, guarded love, of the dangerous world still circling somewhere beyond the estate walls, and she understood with complete certainty now that she was no longer simply a nanny caught up in someone else's crisis. She had become, in every way that mattered, a permanent part of this family's fragile, healing heart, bound to them now by choice rather than circumstance, and unwilling to let anything or anyone tear that bond apart. Gunfire cracked through the quiet morning air, and Grace threw herself against the wall of the hallway, dragging Leo down with her as splinters exploded from the doorframe just above their heads. It had happened so fast. One moment they were walking calmly toward the study, where Dante had promised to show Leo a photo album of his mother as a child, and the next, chaos had erupted through the front entrance as a group of armed men forced their way past the main gate, overwhelming the guards stationed there in a sudden, violent surge. "Stay down," Grace hissed, pulling Leo tightly against her chest as more shots rang out somewhere below them. "Stay down and stay with me." Leo whimpered but did not cry out, his small body trembling as he pressed himself into her side, trusting her completely even in the middle of chaos, the way he had trusted her from that very first hesitant drawing weeks and weeks ago. Grace's mind raced through every possibility, every escape route she had memorized since the last attack, every plan Victor had drilled into the household staff during the tense weeks following the betrayal. The service stairwell. It was close, hidden behind a narrow door near the linen closet, leading down to a rarely used exit near the kitchen gardens. If she could get Leo there, get him outside the immediate line of fire, they might have a chance to reach the safe room Victor had installed in the old wine cellar during the past month's frantic security upgrades. "We're going to move very fast and very quiet," Grace whispered against Leo's ear. "Just like our hiding game, but now we're going to hide somewhere even better. Can you run with me?" Leo nodded, his eyes wide but steady, and Grace felt a surge of fierce pride at his courage even in the midst of her own overwhelming fear. She counted silently to 3, then pulled him up and moved swiftly down the hallway, keeping low, keeping close to the wall, her heart pounding so hard she could feel it in her throat. They reached the linen closet just as more shouting erupted from the main hall, and Grace yanked open the hidden door to the service stairwell, pulling Leo through and pressing it firmly closed behind them. The narrow space was dim and cold, but blessedly quiet compared to the chaos above, and Grace allowed herself one shaking breath before continuing downward, guiding Leo carefully step by careful step. They emerged near the kitchen gardens, the morning sun startlingly bright and ordinary against the violence still echoing from the house behind them. Grace scanned the grounds quickly, spotting 2 unfamiliar figures moving along the far wall, and pulled Leo instead toward the old wine cellar entrance tucked behind a cluster of overgrown hedges, exactly where Victor had shown her weeks earlier. The heavy door groaned as she pulled it open, revealing the reinforced safe room beyond, stocked with supplies, and a direct communication line to the local authorities that Victor had insisted on installing after the previous attack. Grace pulled Leo inside, sealed the door behind them, and finally allowed herself to collapse against the wall, pulling him into her lap as violent shaking overtook her entire body. "Are we safe now?" Leo whispered, his small voice trembling in the dim emergency lighting of the sealed room. "We're safe," Grace said, though she could not stop trembling even as she said it. She reached for the communication panel Victor had shown her, pressing the emergency signal that would alert both his security team and the local police simultaneously, then pulled Leo close against her chest, humming softly to calm them both as the muffled sounds of continued conflict echoed faintly from somewhere above. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours, though the small clock on the panel showed barely 20 had passed before the sounds of gunfire finally faded, replaced by the distant wail of sirens approaching the estate. Grace held perfectly still, unwilling to open the safe room until she was absolutely certain the danger had passed. Until finally, blessedly, Dante's voice reached her through the small speaker embedded in the door, rough with fear and desperate relief. "Grace, Leo, please, if you can hear me, answer." Grace's hands shook as she reached for the panel, pressing the response button with trembling fingers. "We're here. We're both safe." The relief in Dante's voice was audible even through the small speaker. "Thank God." "Thank God. Stay there. I am coming to you now." The heavy door opened moments later to reveal Dante, disheveled and bleeding from a shallow cut along his temple, his expression breaking entirely at the sight of them both alive and unharmed. He pulled them into his arms with a force that spoke of every terrible fear he had carried during those endless minutes of chaos, holding them so tightly that Grace could feel his heart pounding fiercely against her own. "It is over," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "The Calloway family made their move, and my men were ready for them this time. Victor had suspected they might attempt something desperate after we began dismantling their operations these past weeks. They will not threaten this family again." Upstairs, the aftermath of the battle came into focus as police and Dante's own security worked together to secure the estate and account for the intruders, several of whom had been captured, the rest driven back beyond the walls entirely. No one within the household had been seriously injured beyond minor cuts and bruises, a fact that felt like nothing short of a miracle given the violence that had torn through the morning's peaceful calm. In the days that followed, the full scope of what Dante had been planning finally became clear to Grace. Working with authorities and rival families willing to cooperate against a common threat, he had spent weeks quietly building a case that exposed the Calloway family's most dangerous operations, weakening their resources and alliances until this desperate final attack had become their only remaining option, an option that ultimately led to their complete downfall as authorities moved in to arrest their remaining leadership in the chaos's aftermath. "It is truly finished," Dante told Grace one quiet evening, nearly 2 weeks after the attack, as they sat together on the terrace overlooking Isabella's roses, now blooming fuller and richer than they had in months. "The threat that took Isabella from us, that nearly took you and Leo as well, has finally been dismantled completely. My son can grow up now, without the shadow that has hung over this family for years." "How does that feel?" Grace asked softly, watching the last of the sunset paint the garden in warm gold light. "Strange," Dante admitted, a small, genuine smile touching his lips, rare and precious. "I have spent so many years bracing for the next attack, the next betrayal, that I barely remember what it feels like to simply exist without that weight pressing down on every decision. But watching Leo laugh again this past week, truly laugh, without fear shadowing his eyes, I am beginning to remember." Leo himself seemed to sense the shift in the household's atmosphere, his recovery accelerating in ways that amazed even the careful child specialist Dante had brought in to monitor his progress. He spoke freely now, asked endless questions about everything from insects to the stars, and had taken to following Grace through the garden each afternoon, chattering happily about whatever adventure his imagination had conjured that day. One afternoon, nearly a month after the final attack, Leo found Grace sitting quietly among Isabella's roses, the small faded photograph Marta had given her tucked carefully into her pocket where she kept it always. He climbed onto the bench beside her, studying her face with the same serious consideration he brought to most important questions. "Grace," he said carefully, "will you stay with us forever? Not just until I am big, but forever and ever." Grace's heart swelled with emotion at the simple, direct question, tears gathering unexpectedly at the corners of her eyes. "I would like nothing more than that, Leo," she said softly. "If your father agrees, of course." "He already said yes," Leo announced proudly. "I asked him first before I asked you. He said it was the best idea I have ever had." Grace laughed through her sudden tears, pulling Leo into a warm embrace, breathing in the simple, precious joy of a child who had finally, truly healed enough to ask for the things his heart wanted most. Behind them, she heard footsteps approaching along the garden path, and looked up to find Dante watching them both with an expression of complete, unguarded tenderness. The hardened mask he had worn during their very first meeting entirely gone now, replaced by something warm and hopeful and utterly transformed. "He has been planning that question for days," Dante said, coming to sit on Grace's other side. Leo settled happily between them. "Though I confess, I have been hoping to ask you something similar myself, if you will permit me." "What's that?" Grace asked, her heart quickening despite the peaceful warmth of the afternoon. Dante reached for her hand, his thumb tracing gentle patterns over her knuckles exactly as he had done that very first difficult night, months ago, when danger had felt distant, and this fragile growing love between them had only just begun to take root. "Grace Bellamy, you walked into this house as a stranger hired to care for my grieving son, and in the months since, you have become the very heart of this family, the reason both Leo and I have finally remembered how to hope again. I am not asking you to simply stay as his nanny anymore. I am asking you to stay as part of this family permanently, as my partner, as someone Leo can call his own for the rest of his life, if you will have us." Tears spilled freely down Grace's cheeks now, joy overwhelming every lingering fear from the difficult months behind them. "Yes," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "Yes, I will stay. For Leo and for you, and for whatever beautiful, difficult, wonderful life we build together from here." Leo cheered loudly between them, throwing his arms around both Grace and his father at once, his laughter ringing bright and unguarded through the garden, mixing joyfully with the soft rustle of Isabella's roses swaying gently in the warm afternoon breeze, as if even the flowers themselves were celebrating the healing that had finally, fully bloomed within these walls. Victor joined them briefly that evening, formally as part of a small, quiet dinner Dante arranged to thank the staff who had stood beside the family through the worst of the danger. He raised a glass toward Grace with a rare, warm smile. "I have protected this family for many years," he said. "But I have never seen anyone move as fast or as clearly under fire as you did, Grace. Leo owes his life to your instincts that morning, and so, in many ways, does the peace this family finally gets to enjoy." Grace felt her cheeks warm at the praise, still uncomfortable claiming credit for what had felt, in the moment, like nothing more than pure instinct and desperate love for a child who had come to mean everything to her. "I only did what needed to be done," she said softly. "Any of you would have done the same." "Perhaps," Victor said, "but you did it without hesitation, without training, guided by nothing but your own courage. That is rarer than you think." He lifted his glass higher. "To Grace Bellamy, who walked into danger without flinching, not once but twice, and gave this family back its future." The small gathering echoed his toast warmly, Marta having returned for the occasion despite her earlier departure, unable to stay away from the family she had served and loved for so many years once she learned the danger had finally passed. She embraced Grace tightly before leaving that night, whispering quiet thanks against her ear for keeping the family safe when she herself had felt she could not. As the weeks turned into months, Grace watched the estate transform in ways she had once thought impossible. The heavy security measures gradually eased, replaced by a calmer, steadier vigilance that no longer dominated every corner of daily life. Leo returned to his old room without hesitation, the closet that had once hidden him from armed strangers becoming, in his own retelling of the story to visiting cousins, the place where he had once been the bravest boy in the whole world. Dante changed too, in ways both subtle and profound. The guarded coldness that had defined him during their first meeting softened more each week, replaced by an openness Grace suspected few people beyond his son had ever been permitted to witness. He began joining them for the garden walks that had once been simply Grace and Leo's quiet ritual, learning again how to simply exist in ordinary, peaceful moments without the constant weight of calculated danger pressing down on every decision. One crisp autumn morning, nearly 6 months after the final attack, Grace stood in the garden watching Leo chase butterflies among Isabella's roses, now more abundant than ever thanks to the careful attention she had continued giving them in quiet memory of the woman who had planted them first. Dante joined her at the edge of the path, slipping his arm gently around her waist as they watched his son's carefree laughter fill the morning air. "Do you remember," he said quietly, "how certain I was that very first day that you would not last a week in this house?" Grace laughed softly, leaning into his warmth. "I remember. You seemed quite determined to be right about it too." "I have never been more grateful to be wrong about anything in my entire life," Dante said, pressing a gentle kiss to her temple. "You did not simply survive this house, Grace. You transformed it. You gave my son his voice back, and somewhere along the way, without either of us fully realizing it was happening, you gave me my heart back as well." Grace turned to face him fully, her own heart full to overflowing with the quiet, hard-won happiness of a life she had never expected to find within these once cold and frightened walls. "We gave each other something, I think," she said softly. "Courage, maybe. Or simply the willingness to hope again, even after everything that tried to convince us hope was not safe to hold on to." In the months that followed, the mansion that had once echoed with silence and fear slowly filled instead with laughter, music, and the steady, unshakable warmth of a family rebuilt from the wreckage of tragedy. Grace never forgot the frightened, silent boy she had met that very first morning, nor the guarded, grieving father who had doubted anyone could reach either of them. But watching Leo grow bright and fearless, watching Dante learn to laugh freely again, she understood that some of the deepest bonds in life are not born from ease but forged instead through courage faced together, through danger survived side by side, and through the simple, powerful choice to stay when every instinct might have told her to run. She had come to that house as only the nanny. She stayed in the end as its heart.